the Literacy Funders Network. The Literacy Funders Network seeks to bring systemic change and identify opportunities for collective impact around the issue of literacy in our country. The Literacy Funders Network includes funders, practitioners, policymakers, and advocates of literacy. Please go to the website listed on the current slide to learn more about the organization and to take advantage of a limited time free one-year membership under the Become a Member tab. I'm really thrilled that all of you chose to participate in this webinar. We have a great group of people representing funders, advocates, practitioners, policymakers, as this is a critical time in our history for those of us who are involved in literacy. The new Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act contains language that calls for stronger connectivity of adult literacy to the workforce system. And while the words on the paper look good and promising, we who advocate for literacy must be at the table locally, at the state level, and at the national level while the implementation language is being developed. If not, I fear we will be disappointed. I'm also very happy to have the National Skills Coalition partner with the Literacy Funders Network on this very important webinar. The National Skills Coalition provides very valuable and timely information on a variety of education and workforce issues. If you are not on their mailing list, you should be. I'd now like to introduce Sarah Oldmixon, Chief of Development and Strategic Growth for the National Skills Coalition.
Thanks, Bob. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I'm going to be moderating this afternoon's call. As Yuri mentioned just a moment ago, if you have questions during the presentation, please enter your questions into the chat box and on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll collect those questions throughout the call, and then at the end of the presentation, our presenter, Amanda, will take questions and be happy to answer any questions you may have. In addition, if we have some time left at the end of the call, we'll also open up the lines to allow folks to chime in. I'm joined today by my colleague, Amanda Bergson-Shilcock. Amanda is our Senior Policy Analyst here at the National Skills Coalition. She focuses on immigration, adult basic education, and ESL. Prior to joining NSC, Amanda was Vice President of Policy and Evaluation at the nonprofit Welcoming Center for New Pennsylvanians in Philadelphia. She also served as a Policy and Communications Director for Immigrants, a national coalition of nonprofit organizations focusing on the integration of immigrant professionals. Amanda is based in Philadelphia and is joining us there from Philadelphia today. She'll come on the line in just a moment, but let me talk to you just a little bit about the National Skills Coalition before we jump into our presentation. Yuri, can you go to the next slide? The National Skills Coalition is a 15-year-old national nonprofit. We're a nonpartisan organization comprised of a network of a variety of types of organizations all over the United States. We have partners in the business community, community colleges, nonprofits, state workforce agencies, workforce investment boards, the labor community, and elsewhere. Our goal is to create an America that grows its economy by investing in its people so that every worker and every industry have the skills they need to compete and prosper. We accomplish our work through a variety of different activities. They include organizing coalitions throughout the United States around skills policy, advocating for policies, as well as a robust agenda of strategic communications work, including webinars, conference calls, blog posts, social media, and other resources. At the end of the presentation, we'll give you a chance to find out how to stay informed about more of our communications. Let me turn it over to Amanda now, who's going to provide our WIOA conversation. Amanda?
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Bob. I think Bob's point is very apt. The WIOA legislation is a lot of possibility, but in order to make that possibility real, we as advocates, as practitioners, and as philanthropists will really need to put our shoulders to the wheel and make that happen in the implementation phase. So I'm excited to have time today to talk about some of the key features of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, how it differs from previous legislation, and things to be aware of in terms of implementing WIOA in your community. I do want to flag a couple of things before we start. First, because this webinar is designed for funders, there'll be a lot of focus on opportunities for philanthropy in different aspects of WIOA implementation. If you are a practitioner and you're particularly interested in practice implications, we are delighted to have you on today's webinar, and I also encourage you to take a look at the WIOA section on our website, which has additional resources that may be useful to you. Okay, we're going to go to the next slide, please, Yuri. All right, why do we have fireworks on the slide? Well, those of you who have heard me talk about WIOA know that we waited a long time to get WIOA. So Congress reauthorized the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act in the summer of 2014 last year. It took 11 years to get the legislation reauthorized. The original Workforce Investment Act had passed in 1998. It lasted 5 years and was due to be reauthorized in 2003. It was not reauthorized in 2003, and indeed it was 11 years before the legislation was reauthorized. When it was reauthorized, it was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, and you can see the voting numbers on the slide here. And we'll talk in just a moment about some of the costs of having had a bill that was able to garner such overwhelming support. Next slide, please. Okay, so WIOA has 4 titles, or what those of us who don't spend our days reading legislation might think of as chapters. Title I, focusing on workforce development activities, and obviously that can include adult workers, what are called in the legislation dislocated workers, and youth. Title II, also known as the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, AFLA or EFLA, depending on your pronunciation preference. Title III, known as Wagner-Pizer, and Title IV, Rehabilitation, which focuses on services for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. Today, of course, we're going to be focusing on Title II, which does focus on adult education. It includes adult basic education, which is roughly grades 1 to 8 in terms of grade level, adult secondary education, so high school equivalency, GED, HiSET, other exams that help people achieve high school equivalency. Integrated basic education and occupational training. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. And then it formalizes English literacy and civics education. So previously, EL Civics had been authorized on a year-to-year basis by Congress. And in this WIOA legislation, it is formally part of the statute. And so, again, that has some opportunities going forward. It may also, there are also some other issues that come along with that we'll talk about. Okay, next slide. So let's just start for a moment and think about the problem that WIOA is trying to solve. In the U.S. today, there are about 36 million working age adults who have low basic skills. And that means limited literacy, limited math, or limited English proficiency. And those numbers come from a cross-national comparison produced by the OECD that is called the Survey of Adult Skills, or sometimes called the PIAC. And the OECD survey results were released about a year ago. And really, there's some very sobering statistics in there about the scale of basic skills needs in the U.S. Of the 36 million Americans who are working age who have low basic skills, 2/3 are currently employed. So this is not just a challenge for people who are outside of the workforce and hoping to get into the workforce, but also for people who are currently in jobs, perhaps in low-wage jobs, and hoping to be able to advance. Next slide, please. And there's a really keen interest among many of these adults in upskilling or increasing their skills. So these numbers come from the same OECD survey report that I was just citing. 3 million low-skilled adults in the U.S. who are not currently enrolled in adult education would like to enroll, and 6 million who have participated would like to participate more. So we know that there's some pretty robust interest on the part of many people across the U.S. for these kinds of basic education services. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, WIOA is not able to meet the full scale of the need that we've just seen. There's about $700 million in funding nationwide under WIOA Title II, and about 1.6 million people are served. And you can see the breakdown on the slide here as far as which programs within Title II people tend to be participating in. So we already know that there's a pretty significant gap between the number of people who would like to be accessing adult education services and the number of people who are able to be served under the most comprehensive national mechanism we have for serving those individuals. So now we're going to talk about some of the implications of that. Next slide. Each state handles the distribution of WIOA funding differently. So in some states, the adult education funding goes through the Department of Labor. In other states, it goes through a state Department of Education. In some states, it is distributed through a community college system. Many states, once it goes through the state education agency or Department of Labor, it is then regranted to community-based organizations or nonprofits. But the reason we have this slide up here, and you can see for Ohio, the money goes through the Board of Regents, so it's through the higher education system. The reason we have the slide up here is that from a funder's perspective, when you're looking at supplementing or working on adult education issues, it's important to know that the landscape can look really different depending on which state and which community you're operating in. And for many funders, they're grounded in a single geographic community and they know that community very well already. But for other funders, they may be working in different parts of the country. And so it's important to know that unlike other federally funded programs that have a more standardized infrastructure, that is not the case for adult education. Next slide, please. So I talked before about how there was that overwhelming bipartisan majority in Congress. Well, as many of you know, Congress has not been able to agree on many things lately. And so one of the reasons that Congress was able to agree on and pass the law was because there weren't that many changes between the new WIOA legislation and the old WIA law. And so there's a lot more, as we say, may than shall in the WIOA legislation. So there are opportunities to do really interesting and innovative things, but WIOA by itself may not fully be able to drive that innovation, and that's why it's so important that those of us who are in the field are really well grounded in what the legislation includes and how we might build upon it. Next slide, please. So there's really 4 cross-cutting themes across the WIOA legislation that I'm going to talk about. And some of these are somewhat jargony terms. Some you may already be familiar with. And we'll go through each one of them. You can see them listed on the slides here. And I think really the most important thing to know is that these themes cut across each of the different parts of WIOA, so not just Title II Adult Ed, but also Title I. They're in adult, they're in youth, they're in services for people with disabilities. So these are really themes that are very cross-cutting and frankly extend out to the broader field that isn't covered by the WIOA legislation. So next slide, please. So what's different in the adult education, piece of the WIOA legislation? Well, first of all, there's an increased emphasis on workforce preparation, and particularly a tighter connection to Title I workforce services. As many of you may know, there is relatively low, and by relatively I mean very low, co-enrollment. So it's relatively uncommon that an adult participant would be both enrolled in a Title II adult education program and receiving Title I workforce services. The new WIOA legislation is aiming to change that and to better integrate the adult ed programs with the broader workforce system. And we can talk in the question and answer period about some of the issues and questions that people may have coming up around that, but that's just sort of an overarching feature of the law that's important to notice. Next slide, please. WIOA also emphasizes integrated basic education and occupational training, and many of you may be very familiar with models such as iBest or some of the ones that are implemented at LaGuardia Community College or other community colleges nationwide. Essentially, these programs turn the traditional adult ed sequence of programs on its head, and they do something a bit different. So rather than say, well, a person might need to go through 2 or 3 years of ESL classes or 2 or 3 years to get a GED and then be eligible to participate in occupational training, The IBEST type models say we're going to integrate these, often with dual instructors, so we'll have 2 teachers in the classroom, one focusing on basic skills in English or math, and one focusing on occupational training in construction, manufacturing, and healthcare. And these teachers will co-teach, thus providing greater incentive for adult participants to participate and persist in classes, and providing a faster path to an occupational credential that may help adults to increase their earnings or move into the workforce. And as I mentioned earlier, another big change under WIOA is that it permanently authorizes the English literacy and civics education piece, which previously had been a sort of year-to-year authorization. Next slide, please. So looking specifically at immigrants, and I'm flagging this because as you may remember in that earlier slide where we looked at the number of people served by WIOA, it's 1.6 million people nationwide, of whom 700,000 are in ESL classes. Of course, not everyone who's in an English language class is an immigrant, and not everyone who participates in WIOA other than in ESL classes is a native-born American, but in large measure, immigrants are more likely to be served in the ESL component of the adult ed piece of WIOA. And so there's some changes in the new WIOA legislation. First of all, the legislation specifically calls out immigrant professionals, those who have a degree or credentials from their home country, and specifically enumerates that if they have low English skills and are otherwise eligible, they may participate in English language civics education programs. In the past, there has sometimes been confusion about the participation of adults who have credentials from their home country, so this was a clarification. There is ongoing distinctions in the WIOA legislation. So in Title I, to receive employment services, you need to be work authorized. In Title II, the legislation does not ask about immigration status, and that has not been fully reconciled. Congress did not fully address that in the new legislation. So there will be, I think, ongoing discussions about that. There may be additional guidance about that, but we are where we are right now on that question. Next slide, please. So what are the opportunities for funders given some of the changes that I've just outlined? First of all, there's the possibility that funders could assist nonprofits or community colleges or other organizations in scaling up existing integrated education and training programs or launching new ones. And as you heard from my description earlier of what those programs entail, and as you may know already from your own organizations and your own practice or your own grant making, getting a program like that launched is a bit of a heavy lift. It requires rethinking the staffing, rethinking the curricula, rethinking the timing and the duration and intensity of services that participants need to be ready for. And so there's a great opportunity for private philanthropy to support some of the federal push towards more integrated education and training by supporting nonprofits and others who are trying to develop or to expand such programs. And in particular, there can often be challenges in building collaborations between nonprofit organizations and colleges, in part because they're often set up to do quite different things. Nonprofit organizations often help the folks who come through the door and sort of sort out eligibility for which program they might be eligible for, but in any event are trying to provide some kind of service to everyone that comes through the door. Colleges may be more selective in terms of who they're willing to enroll or their process for doing so. They may work on different calendars. They may have different criteria for program completion or for program success. And they may have different internal processes for designing and implementing new programs or measuring the programmatic success as opposed to just the individual participant success. And then finally, another role for philanthropy in WIOA adult education work is really around eligibility gaps. So, earlier today I was speaking with a terrific program in Arizona, And they talked about the fact that when their state enacted legislation a few years ago that required participants in adult education to be work authorized, they had a population of immigrant students that they wanted to serve in GED classes who were not eligible to be served under government-funded programs. They ended up developing a fee-for-service model so that those participants could be self-pay participants, but that's an opportunity where a private foundation would have been able to come in and support that. And in this case, the program in Arizona was able to graduate 136 GED students, 90% of whom then went on to be able to apply for DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and then move from that into occupational training because at that point they then had work authorization. So that's a wonderful example of a nonprofit thinking creatively about serving a client population that was not immediately eligible to be served in their state with public funding. And there are certainly many other examples similar to that in other parts of the country where private philanthropy could provide a really critical bridge for serving people as they transition between eligibility for different public programs. Okay, next slide, please. Oops, I think we went backwards there. Okay, let's go forward. There we go. So many of you may know, and some of you may already be involved in the state planning process under WIOA. So under the WIOA legislation, each state must submit a unified plan to the federal government by March of next year. What does a unified plan mean? A unified plan is one that covers all of the core WIOA programs. You saw that slide earlier where we listed all of the 4 titles of WIOA. It's also possible, and states have the option if they would like to do a more elaborate combined plan. And even though that sounds like the same word, it's really not. And it really means the plan would be WIOA funded programs plus 1 or more additional federally funded programs. For example, the SNAP employment and training for people running food stamps, employment and training programs, the HUD employment-related programs, possibly TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, otherwise known as welfare. So some states are probably going to take a more streamlined approach and do the more modest unified plan. Other states are going to be more ambitious and go for the combined plan. We anticipate that the federal government will release some guidance about this planning process beyond what it has already issued in the draft regulations, but that guidance has not yet been issued. The draft regulations are out, and we can talk about those a little bit later, but the guidance itself focusing on planning is not yet out. Next slide, please. So states are at very different stages of the planning process. New Jersey, for example, had work groups starting last December. They held a conference with 300 attendees in this past March, and they are on track to be moving very quickly with their WIOA planning. Other states are really just now getting underway, and some are thinking that it will be fall before they're really fully engaged in the planning process. There are a number of potential intervention points for adult educators and for philanthropists interested in adult education to be engaged in the planning process. But first and foremost, the key thing is to have the adult education voice at the planning table. In some states, it may be the governor's office that you would want to talk to make sure that adult educators are being represented at the planning table. In other states, depending on your relationship with policymakers, your relationship with state agencies, there may be other channels that you want to work through. But it would, I think, be a real missed opportunity, as Bob was flagging for us at the beginning of this webinar, if these planning processes were to move forward without the input of people who really understand both the realities on the ground of providing adult education within WIOA funded systems, but also the funders who are such important partners and collaborators in amplifying the impact of public investments in adult education. So if we have more questions about the state planning process, I'm happy to tackle those during the Q&A, but I really do want to flag this as a time-sensitive opportunity. The plans are going to be submitted next March to the federal government, and they are 4-year plans. So these are fairly long-term, and this is a great moment to get things articulated in a plan that can then be referenced in future rounds of public funding, but also in program development. Okay, next slide. So another key feature of WIOA is sector partnerships, often known as industry partnerships. And those of you who are longtime friends of National Skills Coalition or who have worked in the workforce field for a long time may be very familiar with this concept already. What WIOA does is it really puts a sort of thumb on the scale from the federal government of saying this is important. States ought to be looking at these, and state and local boards must be really working to implement them. So a sector partnership is a group of multiple employers, partnering with, for example, higher education, nonprofit, public workforce system partners, and others in their community to conduct training for a group of workers in an identified industry or occupation. And that's the broadest possible definition. There's a lot of nuance to that, and we can talk about some of the additional factors that are important to consider, but that's the sort of big picture distillation. Now, why are sector partnerships important when we talk about adult education? Well, for a couple reasons. First of all, adult education is often providing the foundational skills that allow people to be able to be trained in particular occupations. So we talked earlier about the IBEST-like models. But secondly, adult educators are often on the ground with employers in their communities, either providing on-site classes or helping them think through training programs for their incumbent workers. And so it's really important that adult educators also be part of sector partnerships. Now, the WIOA legislation is clear that some communities may have existing sector partnerships that are up and running, but others may not. And so this new legislation really provides an opportunity for communities that have not previously focused on sector partnerships to start thinking through what that would look like in their communities and how it would make the most sense to implement. So it's another moment of opportunity for both philanthropy and practitioners in adult education. Next slide, please. So what does that really look like on the ground for funders? Well, you can see a couple of suggestions at the top of the slide here, but one thing I really wanted to lift up is if you're not already very well familiar with the National Fund for Workforce Solutions, I strongly encourage you to check out their website and learn more about what they work, because it's really a long-term philanthropic model for thinking collaboratively and collectively about the needs of workers and the needs of employers and how to marry the two. And the National Fund has a number of model programs that they've supported around the country that are terrific bases for potential replication. And there are partners both at the National Fund itself, but also in some of the organizations that they funded and supported who could be accessible if you're interested in learning more about some of these models. So I highly recommend sort of exploring what they've done in this arena if this is an area of interest for you. Next slide, please. So we talked earlier about these 4 themes across WIOA. We've talked already about this sector partnerships or industry partnerships. We're going to talk now about career pathways. And the reason I have this really long, dense slide here with all of this text is because this is the first time that the term career pathways has been codified in federal legislation. It's in the WIOA law. We have a written definition. It doesn't exactly match definitions that people have been using elsewhere in the field for a while now, but it relatively well overlaps, I would say, with what we've seen in the field generally. And I've put the most important word on this slide in red, and that's the word "and." So the federal definition of a career pathway is one that includes all of the items listed here, A through G. They don't all have to be offered within the same organization, but they do all have to be offered within the state or in the regional economy that is the area of focus for the career pathway. So I'm going to actually go on to the next slide here, but I would encourage you to bookmark this slide and come back and take a closer look at it after the webinar, just to really help commit to memory the WIOA definition of career pathways, which may be different from the more colloquial definition or the working definition that you have been using in your work over these past several years that career pathways have really come to the forefront. Next slide, please. So this is a very, very simplified graphic. And the goal of this is really just to communicate the idea that career pathways have multiple entry and exit points. And you can see the thick blue arrow going upwards is the idea of a person moving through a career pathway. The small blue arrows at the left are entry points where a person might be coming in. And then the red arrows at the right with the little stars are exits. And the star signifies that a person exits the career pathway at a time when they've achieved a milestone, such as attaining a particular credential. So I like to think of the career pathways as a sort of reality check, right? It would be nice if people were able to put aside their child-rearing responsibilities and their work responsibilities and focus entirely on education, and then move into the workforce and focus entirely on their job. But we know that's not how the American economy actually functions right now, and it particularly isn't how the economy functions for low-wage workers. So career pathways really need to be accessible to people as something they can move into and out of at different stages of their lives and at different stages of their careers. So people might enter at a lower level, for example, in a GED class or other adult education community-based program. They might then move forward into an occupational training program, and they might exit with an initial credential, such as a certified nurse aide credential. They might then come back into the career pathway a year or two later and do additional training and then exit with, for example, a licensed practical nurse credential or a registered nurse credential. So career pathways really do need to be able to be as adaptable as people are in moving in and out of their training and education opportunities as they try to progress in the workforce. And of course, there's a really big sort of unanswered question in the law on career pathways, and that is, how do we make sure that people have the informed guidance they need to accurately navigate through a career pathway? How do we make sure that people have someone who's the equivalent of a case manager or a guidance counselor or an advisor who can help them make wise decisions about what training is available, what jobs would meet that training, what the cost would be of pursuing various types of training, what the resources are in meeting that cost. Without that guidance, there's a real danger that participants might flounder, either staying much longer than they need to in a program that isn't really helping them progress along the career pathway, or being able to, perhaps spending some time sort of chasing false leads or going on wild goose chases in terms of being referred incorrectly to a program. So there's a very great need, and this is a particular opportunity for foundations to provide some support for staff positions that can provide this kind of informed advising and guidance. Next slide, please. So just as we were talking about in the earlier slide, there's some clear opportunities for funders. Some folks on the call today may be familiar with what's called the promotora model in public health. Paraprofessionals who are known and trusted by community members and who are trained to be able to provide informed guidance. And I think there's room in the adult education field to borrow from that public health model and to provide additional resources from philanthropy to support the instructors and the program administrators who are providing adult education services by also funding positions that can really provide informed advising and guidance. Next slide, please. So the last major area I want to talk about before we get to that that clunky term of job-driven investments, is performance measures. So WIOA creates a single set of common performance measures across the core programs, meaning that if you're in a workforce program under Title I, or if you're in an adult education program under Title II, you're going to be measured on the same things. And some of these are very straightforward measures that many of you are already familiar with. Is the person employed? Has the person received a high school equivalency or graduated from high school? But some of them are new. And so the last two that are listed on this slide around measurable skills gains and employer engagement are measures where the federal government is asking for input about how they can best be measured. If this is an area of interest for you as an adult educator or as a funder in adult education, I encourage you to check out the materials on the NSC website and on the WIOA pages on the Department of Education and Department of Labor websites. The federal government is accepting public comment on draft regulations on this issue through June 15th. And we can talk more about details of public comments if folks have questions in the Q&A, but I just wanted to flag that if this is something that is of interest to you and your organization, you have a moment to weigh in here that is going to be fast slipping away. And if you're part of a national or statewide network, you may want to be reaching out to your state or national folks to find out what they're going to be saying about these measures, and if there's a letter or a set of comments that you might want to sign on to. Okay, next slide. There are a lot of unknowns around the performance measures, but there are some things that are very clear. And the first thing is that there's always going to be a cost of compliance. How do we make sure that nonprofits have the data systems they need to be able to collect and then report on this information for the public workforce system that they are part of? And so there's always room for funders to support that, either through specific grants focusing on IT or through general operating support that can help practitioners to acquire what they need. And then there are additional opportunities, and I've listed a couple of them on the slides here, for funders who have a more in-depth interest in evaluation and who might like to weigh in or to convene some discussions in their community on these issues while they are still being decided at the federal level. And I think in particular it's important to support practitioners' ability to be able to use information collected for compliance purposes also for program improvement purposes. Because nonprofits have gotten very, very good at collecting the data that the funders require them to collect, but it's a whole different thing to actually look at that data with an eye towards understanding and improving your programs. And it's very easy for adult educators who are very starved for time to really not have the internal organizational resources to be able to step back and look at the big picture and do that. And so that's a really important role that philanthropy can play in facilitating the ability of practitioners to really look at the data they're collecting beyond just submitting it to public funders. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now we get to one of the clunkier terms here, job-driven investments. What does that mean? Well, as many of you may be thinking, this sounds, from the description on the slide, like something we should have all already been doing, right? We should have been training people for jobs that actually exist, that are connected to openings in our local communities. But as many of you may have heard, sometimes U.S. Secretary of Labor Tom Perez says we have to get away from the train and pray model. The old system was train people and then pray they got a job, but we really have to be more data-based. And so we're going to go on to the next slide here, please. So Vice President Biden oversaw a 6-month process last year of really looking at employment and training programs across the U.S. And coming out of that, his report was issued in July, right at the same time that Congress was signing WIOA into reality. And there were a set of federal principles for what constitutes job-driven training that emerged from Vice President Biden's report and that are going to be underlying federal discretionary grant making for the next few years. And they are listed here on this slide. And I would encourage those of you who are here on the webinar today who may be practitioners yourselves or may be working in organizations that are grant seeking to either commit this list to memory or share it with your development person, because it is a really nice distillation of some of the key factors that the feds are looking for in order to flag that an adult education and workforce program is really going to be relevant with the skills and connections to local employers and drawing on relevant local data information, relevant local labor market information rather, to be able to be effective and to not just be train and pray. So this is a sort of useful summary slide from that perspective. Next slide, please. So what are the opportunities for funders? First, of course, there's the dissemination role, and so some funders, because they have a more national perspective or because they're very plugged into federal solicitations for grant applications, may find out early about upcoming federal grant applications before that has had time to filter all the way down through the various layers of email communications that we all get. And so when those are publicly announced, it can often be helpful for funders to share those public announcements with practitioners. A couple of quick recent examples: there was a US DOL solicitation around apprenticeship programs. There was another on the Tech Hire Initiative, which is an IT training initiative, and there's one out now on sector partnerships. If you are on the National Skills Coalition mailing list, you'll also get notified of these opportunities, but it can be particularly valuable for a local funder who might be interested in supporting such a program or being, in some cases, matching dollars for a program to be able to draw their grantees' attention to such opportunities. And I've put another suggestion up here on the slide as well regarding the federal principles that were listed on the earlier slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've just done a very quick sort of Cook's tour through a lot of the major features of the WIOA legislation with an eye towards impact on adult education and adult education funders. I wanted to use this slide to sort of sum up, what are the opportunities, and really WIOA is more may than shall, and your creative innovation can help to spark not only opportunity for immigrant professionals, but frankly for any participants in adult education or even prospective participants. So can we go on to the next slide, please? Okay, these are a list of key dates coming up for WIOA. You'll all get copies of these slides and recording of today's webinar, and so you don't need to be frantically scribbling these down right now, but I did just want to flag for you that they're in the slide deck. We're going to go on to questions and answers now, and my colleague Sarah Oldmixon is going to moderate that, but I also want to let you know that there are a few more slides that we aren't going to go over, but that are nonetheless part of the slide deck. And so when you get the slides and we send them to you after today's webinar, you may want to take a look at them. They are mostly lists of resources on WIOA itself, on career pathways in particular, that may be relevant to you as an adult educator or as an adult education funder. So let me stop here, and Sarah, let me turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Amanda. So just to reiterate, we will be sending out a copy of the presentation after the call, and a recording of the webinar will also be made available online. I know we had a couple of questions about that from folks who are interested in having that for your notes for down the road. Amanda, we did have a couple of questions. The first set of questions is from folks who had some concerns about inclusiveness under the new law. Michael Hunter noted that while WIOA has language that suggests it's supportive of family literacy, the goals and outcomes in the law really are much more focused on educational gains and potentially leave out people who'd be served under WIA, such as mothers seeking ESOL services or senior citizens who are not in the workforce. Following up on that, Betsy Rubin asked, can other literacy funders pick up the funding gap for serving non-workforce oriented adult learners, such as retired persons or family caregivers? You want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so there both of the questioners are really putting their finger on the pulse of an important question that is not fully resolved. And the short answer is that it is absolutely true that the WIOA legislation is emphatically focused on moving folks into the workforce or helping them advance in the workforce, but it has not fully been determined, I think, at this stage to what extent programs may be able to continue serving participants who don't have an immediate goal of pursuing employment. There's always been the possibility under WIOA that people who are working towards attainment of a GED or people who are working towards attainment of a GED and transition to post-secondary can be served. One of the things that I know several organizations are asking the federal government to do is to issue some guidance on the use of WIOA federal funds versus the use of the state sort of non-federal matching funds, if you will, for WIOA. And so there is a possibility that some states may be able to serve a broader base of participants if the eligibility requirements for the state-funded piece may be somewhat different from the federally funded piece. But the picture is still fairly cloudy in the sense that there's definitely conflicting information on this piece, and I don't think that we have the full answers yet as far as what it's going to mean for the landscape of adult educators, and particularly for adult educators trying to serve people who are at-home parents or people who are full-time caregivers or who are retirees, and may not have those immediate goals of moving into the workforce or moving into post-secondary education. So very important question, and it got a long answer because there isn't a short answer. Next question.
Great. Oswaldo Alvarez asks, are ESL civics the same as ESL? Can you explain the difference between the two?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I'm happy to say to you that there is actually clear guidance in the WIOA statute. So this is one of the times where it actually does help to go back and look at the language of the legislation. So there are two different kinds of English language, or English, what is now being called ELA, English Language Acquisition, that are supported under WIOA. And one of them does focus specifically on civics education, and that includes, there's a set of required activities and then there's a set of optional activities under that, and the other is English language that is not particularly connected to civics education. So both of those definitions exist in the WIOA law, and they're pretty clearly spelled out as far as what can be included and then what must be included and then what may be added at the discretion of the state or discretion of the provider. If anyone wants a specific cite back to the section of legislation that describes those, I'm happy to do that offline, and you can follow up with an email after the webinar, and we'll be glad to provide that for you.
Great. Virginia Carmody would like to know, can you help us understand the role or the significance of NRS and WIOA?
That's a great question. Okay, so NRS are the national reporting standards, and the NRS is a series of 6 or 7 educational functioning levels, basically changes in a person's English and other literacy skills, and they are typically measured with one of a handful of approved standardized tests. So they could be measured with the CASAS test or BEST Plus or the TABE test. The U.S. Department of Education has actually proposed taking the educational functioning level descriptions out of the WIOA regulations and putting them into a less formal process known as an information collection. So in January of this year, the U.S. Department of Education actually proposed new educational functioning level descriptions to the public and was soliciting comments on what those EFLs, as they're known as, should be. And in the draft regulations that came out from the U.S. Department of Education in April, the department is again proposing that they don't want to include the EFLs in regulation because that is a longer and slower process to change in the future. They'd rather leave them out of the regulations and have them addressed in this less formal information collection process. Those of you who are interested in weighing in on the EFLs and changes in them, you should know that there will not be any immediate changes. U.S. Department of Education has been very clear that the current EFLs are going to stay the same for the time being as these potential changes sort of work their way through over the next few years, and that there won't be any immediate changes in the tests that people are able to use to show that their students have made gains in the educational functioning levels. So again, a somewhat detailed answer, but because the issue is quite complex, I wanted to make sure that we sort of address the full range of considerations. And again, I'm happy to talk offline if people have additional questions.
Great, thanks, Amanda. The next question is from Michael Hunter, who is expressing some concern about access to services for undocumented individuals. Michael talks about how the emphasis on shared data in WIOA can be problematic in states, and he points out that in New York, for example, agencies cannot collect Social Security numbers, which makes this cross-agency data collection complicated. He also points out that because funding is based on the number of adults without a high school diploma, it's kind of a strange fit for states like New York, where 70% of the participants will be ESOL learners and not ABE learners. Can you speak to those issues?
I can certainly speak to the first issue. The second issue, I think, is a little outside my bailiwick in the sense that I can't really speak to Congress's intent there. But the first issue is certainly a real one, and one that many states are wrestling with, right? So we talked earlier about the fact that Title I of WIOA, the Workforce Services, does require work authorization, and therefore you can assume that folks who are participating in that should have Social Security numbers. Title II, Adult Education, does not inquire about immigration status, and typically states are not collecting that information. Now, some states may collect it from some of their participants. Some states actually have rulings from their attorneys general that they're not allowed to collect it. So the picture is a bit different in different states. But the clear answer that I can give, Michael, is that it is definitely something that a lot of organizations are alert to. And so the typical way that data matching happens, as you identified, is when there are wage records for a participant in the state's unemployment insurance information system, and the state uses those wage records to verify that somebody who went through an adult education program is now working. But in the prior WIA legislation, the federal government had issued guidance for states on how to conduct data matching or how to verify employment for people for whom wage records were not an option for doing that. And there might be, for example, people who are working in other states. There might be people who are working for the federal government. There might be people who are self-employed, or there might be people who are undocumented and would not be showing up in the regular wage record system. There is an effort going on right now, and National Skills Coalition is including this in our comments as well, to encourage the federal government to issue similar guidance this time around to tell states, here are the other options. If you can't do wage record matching for some of your participants, here are some other ways that you can demonstrate that they have met the employment goals. So that's something that's a work in progress, but it's certainly something that a lot of folks are alert to and paying very close attention to. So thanks for flagging that.
Great. We have another question from Virginia. She says, a few years ago, the federal government emphasized cross-silo collaboration at the federal level, such as having HUD and the Department of Ed work together on promise neighborhoods and choice neighborhoods. Is this similar in that the adult education is being asked to work with welfare and other agencies?
Yeah, I think you've put your finger on a really interesting question, right? So Congress has asked federal agencies and state and local providers to play nicely with each other in the sandbox. But Congress has not necessarily put a lot of detail into what that sort of playing nicely together looks like. And so in some states where services are already very integrated, it may be a less steep climb to that. In other states, I think there's going to be a lot of sorting out to do to figure out, well, what does it mean for programs to be integrated, and what does it mean for career pathways to include, lower level options for people who are coming out of community-based adult education programs and aren't yet at the community college level. So I think this is an area where there's both a huge amount of opportunity as adult educators to really bring the expertise of adult education practitioners and funders into discussions that frankly may not have had that expertise in them before. It's also a challenge, and I've certainly heard from some adult educators who are fearful that they or their programs are going to get a little steamrollered in their states by the larger size and sometimes greater political heft of workforce programs. So I wouldn't, sort of dismiss concerns that people have, but I do think, there's a lot of uncertainty at this point, but there's also a lot of possibility and a lot of potential. And those of you who haven't already may be interested in the webinar that National Skills Coalition did recently with an accompanying case study of how New Jersey is tackling its state WIOA planning and is tackling some of those questions about having those programs working together.
Thanks, Amanda. And just as a reminder for folks, that webinar on New Jersey's planning experience is tomorrow afternoon at 1:30 Eastern. So if you're interested in participating in that, please go to the National Skills Coalition website and you can learn more about it there. We're right at 3 o'clock. I know we had one other question that was about a specific WIOA state plan. If folks are really interested in learning more about what may be going on in your state, please feel free to contact us. We can put you in touch with some of our staff who've been working with some of the state agency leaders as well as coalitions of advocates in the states, and can tell you a little bit more about what we know about what's going on in the states around WIOA planning. In the meantime, Yuri, can you take us to the last slide? Yeah. So within the presentation, you'll see that there's a link to both visit our website as well as to sign up for our member email list so that you can stay in touch and learn more about other webinar opportunities like this one. So with that, thank you, Amanda. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and thank you to Bob for bringing us together. Bob, did you have any final words before we log off?
I just want to thank you. I thought that was a great presentation. Really touched on a lot of the important issues. And for those who are on who are not funders, please direct your funders in your community to this webinar once it goes up on the National Skills Coalition website. Again, I think there's a lot of reason for excitement, but I also think there's some reason for caution, and then also great opportunities to have a lasting impact for literacy in this community. Thank you again, Amanda and Sarah.
All right, thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone.